Chicago, winter of 1984. The wind off Lake Michigan bit through the layers of wool and denim like a cold memory that refused to fade. And the city, though lit by traffic lights and neon, felt muted, as if even the buildings had grown tired of standing. On the corner of Wabash and Jackson, beneath the rusted scaffolding of an old elevated train station, sat a man wrapped in blankets, cardboard, and silence. People passed him by like smoke in the wind. Some glanced, most didn't. His name was James Whitaker. Nobody knew that anymore. In shelters, they called him the Colonel, though no one knew whether he had really served, or if the title had been born of the way he held himself, straight-backed, eyes alert, even when tired. What they didn't know was that in the inner lining of his worn-out army coat, hand-stitched into a secret pocket, lay a silver star, awarded to Sergeant Whitaker in 1944 for extraordinary heroism during the Battle of Monte Cassino. He touched it every morning before the city awoke. His fingers found the familiar edges of the medal like prayer beads. It wasn't pride that made him keep it close. It was memory of a promise whispered in the mud of southern Italy, and of a woman with eyes like dusk and hands that healed more than wounds. Her name was Evelyn. She was a Red Cross nurse stationed near the front. He had met her between bombings, somewhere outside of San Pietro. They had no time for slow romance, only urgency, letters and glances exchanged between evacuations. But in that brief, desperate time, they fell in love like people who knew they might never see each other again. Before his unit moved out, he took her hand in a burned-out farmhouse and said, "If I make it home, I'll find you, I swear." But wars don't end for everyone when the shooting stops. When he returned stateside, everything was different. The letters he sent were never answered. Her address had changed. The military moved on, and so did the country. Jobs were scarce, and veterans like him, especially those with scars you couldn't see, often fell through the cracks. Over time, the silence hardened into habit. He drifted, first from job to job, then from town to town. By the 1970s, he stopped explaining himself. By the 80s, he stopped speaking much at all. All he had left was the coat, the medal sewn inside it, and the memory of Evelyn, still waiting maybe, or maybe not. He never knew. Until that day, when a woman knelt in front of him with a thermos of hot soup and saw something glinting in the folds of his coat. If this story is touching your heart the way it touched mine to write it, please give us a like and subscribe to the channel. We share stories every day that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what happens next will change everything. The morning unfolded slowly over the city of Chicago, not so much arriving as drifting in through a curtain of low clouds and diesel-scented air, the light filtering weakly between buildings crusted with ice and memory. While beneath the clattering tracks of the Red Line, James Whitaker moved through the streets like a man stitched into the very fabric of the city, not as someone seen or acknowledged, but as a presence that lingered at the edge of everyone's awareness, half forgotten, yet always there. He walked with the measured pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to go, but still carried the rhythm of marching in his bones, a soldier's gait worn down to habit, and though his coat was threadbare, stained, and patched more times than he could recall, he wore it with the quiet pride of someone who knew what it once represented. Not warmth, not protection, but memory, sacrifice, and a link to a life that no longer existed outside of his own fading mind. On this particular Saturday, with the wind slicing down from Lake Michigan in sharp gusts that turned every breath into a challenge, James had returned to a familiar corner just outside the Harold Washington Library, where the steam grates offered a pocket of warmth, and the passing foot traffic gave him a measure of anonymous company, because while he didn't expect kindness from strangers, there was something oddly comforting about being ignored in the same place each day. He didn't speak much, hadn't in years, and those who noticed him at all often mistook his silence for confusion or madness, never guessing that behind those weathered eyes lay a memory sharper than most, a library of images and voices catalogued by pain, loss, and the strange ache of promises unkept. And in the hollow space beneath his ribs, a name still echoed, Evelyn, a name he never said aloud, but which he carried as carefully as he did the medal sewn into the inside of his coat. A silver star, awarded not for heroism he remembered fondly, but for a moment of desperation and fear in a monastery in Italy where he had dragged two men to safety beneath the roar of machine guns and prayed not for glory, but for survival. It was while adjusting a strip of torn cardboard beneath him that the corner of his coat flared open in the wind, revealing a glint of aged silver tucked between the folds, a flicker of metal that might have gone unnoticed by most, but not by Sarah Kaplan, who happened to be walking past with a tote bag full of lesson plans and photocopies of old war letters on her way to lead a seminar on oral histories of American veterans in the public library, just a block away. Sarah had been raised on stories of Monte Cassino, on fragments of memory passed down in her father's slow, halting voice. A man who rarely spoke of the war unless he'd had a scotch in hand and the house was quiet, who once told her about a fellow soldier named Whitaker who pulled him from the rubble after a blast, then disappeared before he could say thank you. A ghost, he called him, though none ought unkindly, more with reverence, as if some men were meant to vanish like that with dignity and dust. So when she saw the shimmer of the medal, she stopped walking, turned slowly, and approached the man with the cautious respect one offers a living relic, her voice low, steady, and unsure if she was crossing a line. "Sir, is that the Silver Star?" James looked up, his eyes narrow beneath the shadow of his knit cap, his fingers curling protectively over the flap of his coat, and for a long moment he said nothing, just stared, as if measuring her for sincerity, weighing her words against years of silence, then finally nodded once, barely perceptible, as if to confirm what she already knew but didn't yet understand. "My father," she said, kneeling down despite the cold soaking through her jeans, "was David Kaplan. He served with the 36th Infantry. He told me about a man named Whitaker. He said you saved his life." James didn't react immediately, but his mouth tightened, his brow furrowed, and something distant flickered in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but the slow dawning of recognition, like a melody returning to someone who had long since forgotten it. And when he finally spoke, his voice was gravel and smoke. He carried a book of poems in his pack, never went anywhere without it. Sarah smiled, though her eyes stung from more than just the wind. "That's him," she said. "He taught poetry after the war. He talked about you. He never stopped wondering what happened." James looked away, then down at his coat, his fingers brushing the stitch where the medal lived, and when he looked up again his voice cracked, not from emotion, but from years of disuse. "I didn't disappear. I just stopped being found." That night, after Sarah had walked away, not with pity or charity, but with the quiet reverence of someone who had just touched the edge of a story she had heard only in fragments, James sat in his usual spot, beneath the L-tracks, the streetlight above him flickering like a weak pulse, and allowed himself, for the first time in years, to remember not just the facts of the war, but the feelings that lived between them, the unsaid truths buried beneath orders, mud and blood. And as the city moved around him in the indifferent rhythm of late-night traffic and distant sirens, he closed his eyes and was no longer in Chicago, but back in Italy, in 1944, where everything he had ever loved had begun and ended. The mountains around Monte Cassino had been cruel and unrelenting, soaked in smoke, rain, and the cries of men too young to have already seen so much. And James, then barely 22, had learned quickly that heroism was not a matter of courage, but of endurance, of being the last man to move when everyone else had frozen, of running through fire not because you were brave, but because someone was screaming and you couldn't ignore it. And in that chaos, between the rubble of ancient stone and modern devastation, he met Evelyn. She was a nurse with the Red Cross, assigned to a field unit not far from the front. and though she wore her hair tucked under a cap and her voice was often taut from exhaustion, there was something in her presence that felt like home. Not the house he'd left in Kansas, but the idea of safety, of gentleness, of something more human than orders shouted over gunfire. They met when he was brought in with shrapnel near his shoulder, and she stitched him without flinching, her fingers steady even as the tent shook from shelling nearby. And when he looked at her and whispered, "You ever scared?" she only smiled and said, "Of course, but I do it anyway." They spoke in broken moments, after triage, before transfers, and the language they built between them wasn't full of grand declarations, but glances, brief touches, and the shared silence of people who knew that nothing could last, which is why, on the night before his unit was ordered to push forward into what would become one of the bloodiest battles of the campaign, he found her in the SUP. Ply tent, took her hand, and made her a promise he never stopped trying to keep. "If I get through this, I'll come back, I'll find you, no matter what it takes." But the war ended differently than anyone had expected, not with triumph, but with exhaustion. And when he returned home, discharged and alone, America was already moving on. Parades were over, factories were humming, and no one seemed to want to hear about where he had been, especially not when he tried to explain that he wasn't just looking for work or peace, he was looking for her. He wrote letters, dozens, addressed to field hospitals, to Red Cross offices, to a Kansas City address she once mentioned when half asleep, and though he poured his words out carefully, each one like a lifeline tossed across an ocean, none of them were answered. And in time, as the months stretched into years and each letter came back marked undeliverable or not at all, he began to wonder whether Evelyn had ever existed beyond the battlefield, or if she had, whether she had forgotten him, moved on, built a life with someone whose promises were not broken by borders and bureaucracies. He didn't blame her. How could he? The country was tired, the system clogged, and men like him, who had seen too much and said too little, didn't fit into the stories America wanted to tell about itself anymore. So he faded slowly, not with drama, but with silence, first from his family, then from friends, then from society, until all that remained was a coat, a medal, and a name. He spoke only to himself when the wind got too loud to hear anything else. And now, after all those years, Sarah Kaplan had come to him with the name of a man he once saved, and a voice that sounded just enough like Evelyn's to crack the shell he had built around himself. Not because she brought back the past, but because she offered something rarer, the possibility that not all of it had been lost. He sat there in the cold, hands folded, eyes closed, and whispered her name, once softly, as if, by speaking it aloud, he could finally forgive the years for stealing her from him, or himself for letting her go. It was a quiet Sunday morning when Sarah returned, just as she said she would, her coat wrapped tight against the wind, a wool scarf around her neck, and a determined look in her eyes that James recognized not as pity, but as purpose. The kind of gaze worn by people who had found something too important to ignore and were now following its thread wherever it might lead, even if that path was tan, gled in time and silence. And when she asked him gently if he'd be willing to come with her, just for a few hours, to have a warm meal and go through some of her father's things, he hesitated, not from distrust, but from the weight of accepting an invitation that sounded too much like stepping back into a world he no longer believed he had any right to touch. But he went. The apartment was small but filled with light. A second-floor walk-up in a quiet neighborhood just outside Lincoln Park, with books stacked in every corner and photographs lining the walls, none of them posed, all of them real, moments captured in soft focus and stillness. And as James stepped inside, the smell of coffee and roasted potatoes wrapped around him like memory, and he stood in the hallway for a moment, unsure whether to remove his coat, unsure if this warmth was something he was allowed to feel. Sarah didn't rush him. She offered him a chair by the window, a blanket across his legs, a plate of food that he ate slowly, carefully, as if savoring not just the flavor but the unfamiliar comfort of being served. and when they were finished, she brought out a dusty cardboard box from the back of a closet. One of those boxes people keep not for show, but because they're afraid of what it would mean to throw them away. My dad kept these, she said softly as she opened the lid. Photos, letters, notes, most from the war, some from after. She laid the contents gently across the table. Yellowed envelopes, field maps, snapshots of young men in uniform, and then, tucked between two folded letters, a photograph that stopped James's breath like a sudden cold wind. It was Evelyn, not in uniform, not beside a stretcher or a tent, but standing in what looked like the porch of a small farmhouse, her hair loose around her shoulders, a tired but radiant smile on her face, and in her arms, wrapped in a knitted blanket, a baby, no more than a few months old, asleep against her chest. On the back, in faded cursive ink, were the words, Evelyn and Michael, June, 1945. James stared at it for a long time, his hands trembling slightly as he held it, not because he doubted what he was seeing, but because it confirmed what he had never dared to hope, that she had survived, that she had lived, and that she had carried something of him into a world he never got to know. "That's my grandfather," Sarah said quietly, watching his face. James looked up slowly, the weight of recognition pulling his eyes down again almost immediately. "Michael," he whispered. "She named him Michael." Sarah nodded. "She never talked about it much. My dad didn't even know who his father was, just that Evelyn raised him alone in Michigan. She worked at a school, never remarried." He tried to speak but couldn't. His throat burned with something thicker than grief, the realization that he had missed an entire life, that he had not only lost Evelyn, but also the chance to know the boy who had come from them, who had grown up to be a man, who had died just 3 years ago without ever knowing the truth. "I thought she'd forgotten me," James said finally, his voice barely audible. "Thought maybe I was a mistake she didn't want to remember." "She kept your medal," Sarah said, pulling a smaller box from the bottom of the crate. "It was in her drawer when she passed, along with this photo." He took it, opened it, and there it was. Another silver star, identical to his, but newer, untouched by weather and war. He held it against his chest, and for the first time in decades, allowed himself to weep, not from shame, but from the terrible, tender knowledge that he had been remembered, that she had waited in her own way, even if the world hadn't let them find each other again. Sarah sat beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "You weren't forgotten," she said. "You were just hidden by history." And in that moment, surrounded by the echoes of a family he never knew he had, James felt something shift inside him. Not an erasure of pain, but the beginning of something else, belonging. The days that followed were slow and quiet, filled not with conversations or confessions, but with the kind of silence that wraps itself around people who are learning to breathe again after decades of holding their breath. And for James, even though the warmth of Sarah's apartment, the kindness of her voice, and the gentle rhythm of a space that welcomed him without condition gave him something close to peace, there remained a knot deep inside his chest, a heaviness that no comfort could easily untie, because it wasn't about where he was, but about where he had been. He moved through her home like a man on borrowed time, careful not to leave footprints, not to take up space, not to disrupt the life that had opened itself to him with such grace. And every time Sarah offered him a cup of coffee, a folded blanket, a question wrapped in care, he answered with gratitude, but also with caution, because something in him still whispered that all of this was temporary, that he didn't belong here, that he was too late, too damaged, too forgotten to start mattering again. One morning, as the frost curled against the windows and the smell of toasted bread drifted through the apartment, he sat at the kitchen table with his hands folded in his lap, eyes lowered to the floor, and said, with the quiet clarity of someone who had rehearsed the words 100 times, "I don't know if I can be part of this." Sarah, seated across from him, her hair pulled back, her sweater sleeves rolled to her elbows, didn't answer right away. She let the silence settle, not as a burden but as a cushion, and then said simply, "Why not?" He looked up at her. eyes raw. Because I've been sleeping on sidewalks, Sarah. Because I spent more nights talking to shadows than to people. Because your father, my son, lived an entire life I wasn't there for. I didn't raise him. I didn't protect him. I didn't even know him. His voice cracked under the weight of every year he had lost, and when he stood, the chair scraping against the tile like a regret, he turned away, ashamed to be crying in a home he hadn't earned, grieving a life that wasn't entirely his to grieve. But Sarah rose too, and with a steadiness that came not from pity but from love, forged in understanding, she placed a hand on his arm and said, "You didn't choose to disappear, James. The war did that. The silence did that. The world wasn't kind to men like you. But that doesn't mean you're not part of this. You're not here because you earned it. You're here because you are it." He didn't answer, not at first, but he sat back down. Later that afternoon, she made a phone call to a local veterans outreach center she'd worked with before, and within the week, she helped him move into a quiet room in a nearby transitional housing facility for veterans, where he could have a bed, privacy, and regular meals, but also dignity, because while he wasn't ready to call it home, it was the first place in years that didn't feel like exile. She helped him hang the framed photo of Evelyn and Michael by the window. Below it, on a small table, they placed the medal, not hidden, not stitched into fabric, but displayed openly, respectfully, as if to say, "This story happened, and it mattered." They visited the cemetery together on a chilly March morning, the kind where the sky hung low and the trees stood bare. And there, at the gravesite of Michael Whitaker, father, teacher, soldier, James stood with a single rose in hand and whispered, "I'm sorry," before placing the flower down and stepping back, not with fear, but with reverence. Sarah took his hand. "You didn't fail him," she said. "You found him." And somehow that was enough. The residence for veterans sat on the edge of the city, nestled between quiet trees and the low hum of a world that moved just fast enough to remind its residents that life still went on, but slow enough not to leave them behind. And for James Whitaker, who had spent so many years watching the world from sidewalks and steam grates, it was the first place in decades where the passing of time felt gentle. Not like a countdown, but like a gift. His room was modest. A single bed, a desk, a dresser, and a window that looked out onto a courtyard where sparrows gathered in the morning. But it was his, and each morning, as the light filtered in through the thin white curtains, he sat quietly in the armchair beside the heater, sipping coffee and looking at the photograph Sarah had framed and hung above the desk. Evelyn holding baby Michael, her smile soft but strong, the past preserved not in mourning but in memory. Beside it, on a small table, rested the silver star. It no longer lived hidden in the lining of his coat. It no longer bore the weight of silence. It was no longer a burden. Now it was simply what it had always been, proof not of perfection, but of presence, of action, of life that, though fractured, had mattered. Sarah visited him weekly, sometimes with stories from her students, sometimes with letters from Michael's grandchildren, children who now called him Grandpa James, not because he had earned the title in the usual way, but because they had chosen to offer it freely, and because he, for once, had found the courage to accept it. The staff at the home came to know him not as the quiet one, but as the man who had walked through history with dust on his boots and silence in his mouth, who now spoke, not often, but meaningfully, and who kept a well-worn paperback of Robert Frost on his nightstand, a gift from Sarah, with certain lines underlined so heavily that the ink had bled through the page. One spring morning, with the trees beginning to bloom, and the world outside his window waking up after a long and stubborn winter, James passed away in his sleep, peacefully, without pain, with the medal in his hand and Evelyn's name on his lips. The memorial was simple, but full. Sarah gave the eulogy, standing at the front of the chapel in a navy blue coat, her voice steady as she told the story, not of a homeless man, not of a forgotten soldier, but of a father, a lover, a friend, and a man who, Even when history tried to erase him, left behind a legacy that proved memory cannot be buried forever. At the front of the room, beside the folded flag and the medal, stood a photograph framed in oak with a small brass plate that read, "James Whitaker, soldier, father, witness, never forgotten." If this story moved you the way it moved me to write it, please give us a like and subscribe to the channel. We post new videos every day, true stories that inspire, heal, and remind us what it means to be human.